Introduction: the confession that changed everything. Dani Pedrosa spent his entire MotoGP career built around one fundamental rule, one principle that he understood more deeply than almost any other rider of his generation. If you don't trust the front, you cannot race. Not race competitively, not race at the limit, not race the way MotoGP demands to be raced with total commitment, zero hesitation, and the absolute certainty that when you tip the bike into a corner at 200 kilometers per hour, the front tire will hold exactly where you need it to hold. Trust the front or don't race at all. So when Jorge Martin stood in the paddock after the Brazilian Grand Prix and said quietly, carefully, with the measured tone of a man choosing his words with full awareness of what they meant, we are much more in trouble. Our front is much less stable and precise. That wasn't frustration talking. That was a confession. And in the world of MotoGP, where weakness is never admitted publicly, where garage problems stay inside garages, where riders protect their team's image even when everything is falling apart, a confession like that is seismic. Ducati didn't lose Brazil because Aprilia was simply faster. They lost Brazil because they couldn't enter a corner without negotiating with their front tire like it might betray them at any moment. And once that negotiation begins, once the rider is thinking about the front, instead of trusting it, the race is already gone. Because MotoGP is not won on the straight, it is not won on corner exit, it is not even won through superior tire management or late race stamina. It is won at one precise, irreversible moment, the moment a rider commits the bike into the corner and decides in a fraction of a second whether he owns that space or not. At Brazil, Aprilia owned that space. Ducati didn't. That is the wound, and it runs deeper than one race result. Chapter 1. The contradiction that Saturday made worse. The most unsettling part of what happened in Brazil wasn't the Sunday result in isolation. It was the contrast between Saturday and Sunday that made the result truly impossible to ignore. On Saturday, Ducati looked completely untouchable. Marc Márquez won the sprint race. Jorge Martin finished second. Clean, fast, controlled. The Ducati machinery looked exactly the way it had looked for the past 2 seasons, dominant, precise, and operating at a level that made every other manufacturer look like they were competing in a different category. Then Sunday arrived. Same track, same riders, same machines, same conditions, or so everyone assumed. No factory Ducati on the podium, one of them in the gravel. And Aprilia's Francesco Bagnaia, Bezzecchi on the Aprilia leading from lights to flag with a control and a composure that made Ducati's entire operation look like it was reacting rather than acting. That kind of reversal doesn't happen because of form. Form fluctuates slightly. Form explains a tenth here, a position there. Form does not explain a complete structural reversal between a sprint race on Saturday and a full Grand Prix on Sunday. What explains it is something structural, something that only revealed itself when the conditions stopped being perfect. Grip dropped as the race progressed. Temperature climbed through the afternoon. The track surface, already on the edge, went loose in exactly the wrong way, at exactly the wrong time. And suddenly, like a light switching off, Ducati stopped attacking corners. They started surviving them. That is the moment the race was taken from them. Not by Aprilia making a heroic move, not by Bezzecchi suddenly finding 3/10 nobody knew he had. The race was taken from Ducati by their own front tire and by the fact that when it stopped giving them what they needed, they had no answer. Chapter 2. What happens when the front disappears. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you have to understand what actually happens to a MotoGP rider when front-end confidence disappears. It is not a simple, visible collapse. It is not a crash or a dramatic moment. It is a series of tiny, cascading adjustments that each cost fractions of a second, and together, they cost the race. First, entry speed drops. The rider moves his braking marker backwards, 2 meters, 5 meters, 10 meters. Suddenly, he is arriving at the corner slower than his rival. Not massively slower, not obviously slower to the naked eye, but measurably, decisively slower. Second, lean angle becomes a calculation instead of an instinct. Instead of flowing into the corner with complete commitment, the rider is deciding consciously how far he is willing to push the bike when he cannot fully trust what the front will do. That conscious management is the enemy of lap time. Third, and most critically, track position inside the corner is surrendered. The rider who enters slower, who hesitates even fractionally, ends up wider through the corner than his rival. Wider means later on the throttle. Later on the throttle means the exit, however strong the bike's exit might be, is no longer an attack. It is damage limitation. And once you are doing damage limitation in a MotoGP race, you are no longer racing the rider ahead, you are racing your own limitations. Dani Pedrosa understood this better than almost anyone. He spent years at Honda extracting front-end trust in conditions where other riders simply gave up and managed. He knew that the moment you stop trusting the front, everything downstream, exit speed, tire life, race strategy, becomes irrelevant. Because none of it matters if you never owned the corner to begin with. Ducati never owned the corners in Brazil. Number. Chapter 3. Aprilia's permission slip. Now look at Bezzecchi's race through the same analytical lens. He wasn't defending, he wasn't conserving, he wasn't riding at 10/10 every single lap trying to hold off a charging rival. He was doing something far more dangerous, far more difficult, and far more revealing about the fundamental difference between the two bikes. He was arriving at every corner already in control. The front tire stayed planted. The bike accepted lean angle without a moment of hesitation. The entry speed remained high, not just in the early laps when grip was at its best, but deep into the race when the surface was at its worst, when conditions were demanding the most trust from both machine and rider. That consistency, that absolute lap-after-lap predictability is what separated Bezzecchi from every Ducati rider on the circuit. He didn't produce one spectacular lap. He produced 40-something identical laps, same entry, same line, same exit, same commitment, over and over until the race was gone. That is not dominance in the conventional sense. That is something more dangerous. That is stability weaponized. When a Ducati rider says publicly that he tried to match Aprilia's entry speed and simply couldn't, that the bike wouldn't allow the same commitment into the corner, he is not describing a bad day. He is describing a permission problem. Bezzecchi had permission from his bike. The Aprilia chassis, the aerodynamic package, the front-end geometry working together gave him explicit permission to enter every corner at the speed the corner demanded. Ducati's riders were asking for that same permission and getting a different answer. And when one bike allows aggression while the other demands caution, the race is already decided long before anyone crosses the finish line. Chapter 4. The Marc Márquez problem. Of all the things that happened in Brazil, perhaps the most revealing was what happened to Marc Márquez specifically. Because Márquez is not a rider who fades quietly, he is not a rider who accepts fourth place without a fight. His entire identity as a motorcycle racer, the thing that made him one of the most thrilling, most dangerous, most electrifying champions the sport has ever produced, is built on dictating races. He doesn't follow, he imposes. He shapes races around his own terms. He uses his front-end aggression, his willingness to enter corners at angles and speeds that other riders simply won't attempt, as the primary weapon in his entire competitive arsenal. Watch what happened in Brazil. Márquez didn't collapse. He didn't make a catastrophic mistake. He didn't get outpaced in any obvious, visible way. He finished fourth, which on paper looks respectable. But watch the race properly, not the highlights, not the final standings. Watch what Márquez was actually doing lap after lap, and you see something deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't building pressure. He wasn't managing the race from a position of control, waiting for his moment to strike. He was reacting. He was responding to a race he couldn't shape, couldn't influence, couldn't bend to his will. That is not the Marc Márquez system. That is a rider adapting brilliantly, professionally, but still adapting to a machine that wouldn't let him do what he does. Then came lap 6, the moment that told the whole story in a single sequence. Jorge Martin dives inside Márquez. Both riders run wide. Jorge Martin from further back passes them both. Ducati versus Ducati in the middle of the race, with Aprilia watching from the front and an independent Ducati satellite rider exploiting the chaos behind them. That moment wasn't an accident. That was the front-end problem playing out in real time. Two Ducati riders trying to force the issue, neither able to execute cleanly, both paying the price simultaneously. And the race never came back to them. Because you cannot rebuild front-end confidence in the middle of a race. You can manage tires, you can adjust lines, you can wait for your rival to make a mistake. But you cannot manufacture front-end trust that the bike isn't giving you. Not at this level, not at this speed, not under these conditions. Number. Chapter 5. The physics of the problem. This is not purely a feeling problem. This is not just about rider psychology or confidence or mental state. This is load distribution, front tire behavior under low grip, measurable, physical, engineering level reality. When grip drops, when the track surface loses its bite, when temperatures push the tire outside its optimal operating window, the front tire becomes unpredictable in very specific ways. Microslides increase. The feedback window that the rider relies on to feel what the front is doing narrows dramatically. The margin for error shrinks at exactly the moment when everything is most uncertain. This is precisely the condition that Dani Pedrosa spent years mastering at Honda. He was not the fastest rider on the grid, he was not the most spectacular. But he was the rider who most consistently extracted maximum front-end trust when grip disappeared, who read the front tire's behavior more accurately than anyone else and found performance in conditions that destroyed others. What Aprilia has built, apparently, is a bike that preserves that feedback even when conditions deteriorate. The chassis geometry and aerodynamic package keep the front tire loaded and readable through the precise moments when Ducati's front starts to move, starts to give uncertain signals, starts to force the rider's brain to react defensively before the bike has fully let go. That defensive reaction, that involuntary protective hesitation is enough. At MotoGP level, hesitation is measurable in tenths of a second. You don't see it as a mistake. You see it as, he's just not quite there today. The illusion is that the rider is underperforming. The reality is that the system forced him to operate below his actual capability. Ducati's entire performance philosophy has been built around rear grip and exit performance, strong acceleration out of corners, exceptional tire preservation through long race stints, late race strength when rivals are managing degradation. It is a philosophy that wins championships. It has proven that repeatedly. But it assumes one foundational thing. It assumes the rider can arrive at the corner with enough front-end confidence to execute the plan. Once that assumption breaks, the entire downstream advantage becomes irrelevant. All that rear grip means nothing if you're entering the corner slower than the bike in front of you. You're not attacking, you're queuing. And once you're queuing in a MotoGP race, even Marc Márquez is just another rider in traffic. Number. Chapter 6. The blueprint that now exists. Here is where Brazil's implications extend far beyond one race result. Before Brazil, there was a suspicion visible at Sepang in the low grip conditions, hinted at in other races where the surface was less than perfect, that Ducati had a condition-dependent vulnerability. A chink in the armor, something that careful track conditions and perfect setup had been masking through the earlier part of the season. Brazil didn't create that vulnerability, it exposed it. It removed the mask completely in front of every team, every engineer, every rider, and every analyst in the paddock. And here is the most dangerous consequence of that exposure. A blueprint now exists. Every other manufacturer on the grid has now seen it demonstrated in full detail over 40-plus laps of a Grand Prix. They know what works. They know the conditions that compromise Ducati. They know the approach. Keep Ducati in situations where the front is under stress. Force them to hesitate on entry. Don't let them build rhythm early in the race. Deny them the clean, controlled corner entries that their entire performance package depends on. That is the blueprint. And once a blueprint exists at this level, it gets repeated, it gets refined, it gets deployed at every circuit where conditions permit, over and over, until the team either finds the fix or the season slips away from them. Aprilia doesn't need to outdevelop Ducati wholesale. They don't need to find more straight-line speed, more corner exit, more tire longevity. They just need races where grip isn't perfect. And the MotoGP calendar, with its variety of surfaces, temperature ranges, and track characteristics, gives them plenty of those. Every variable that introduces uncertainty now favors the bike that trusts the front. Right now, that is Aprilia. Chapter 7. The pattern that makes it worse. Look at the broader pattern, not just the Brazilian result. Bezzecchi didn't just win Brazil. He led every single lap. That is 4 races in a row, not 4 victories necessarily, but 4 complete control cycles. 101 laps of racing without a single lap led by anyone else. That is not form. Form doesn't produce that kind of consistency. That is system dominance. And it is built on something that becomes more dangerous the more you examine it: predictability. When grip disappears, Aprilia's riders get more aggressive. Their feedback improves relative to the chaos. They find more information to work with, not less. When grip disappears, Ducati's riders get more careful. They lose information, they hesitate, they protect. That is the leverage shift. And once a leverage shift, this fundamental takes hold, it doesn't stay contained to one circuit or one set of conditions. It spreads. Riders feel it. They talk about it in debriefs. Competitors observe it from the garage. The dynamic amplifies. Marquez knows it already. He doesn't need an engineering debrief to understand what fourth place in Brazil meant. He had the speed. He didn't have the control. And for a rider whose entire competitive identity is built on controlling races, on dictating terms, on shaping outcomes, that is not a bad day. That is a warning. And the dangerous response to that warning for a rider of Marquez's nature is to push harder, to compensate with aggression what the setup isn't delivering through natural feel. And pushing harder on an unstable front doesn't solve the problem. It amplifies it. It shortens the margin for error at precisely the moment it is already at its narrowest. That is how mistakes begin. Not from lack of skill, from overcompensation. And Ducati has seen this pattern before they understand it intimately. The difference this time is that it is not a rider struggling to adapt to a difficult bike. It is a dominant, championship-winning bike starting to show a condition-dependent weakness for the first time. That is fundamentally harder to address, because you are not correcting a flaw in a struggling design. You are rebalancing a philosophy in a successful one. Chapter 8. The compromise Ducati cannot avoid. To fix this problem, Ducati faces a genuine engineering dilemma. Their front-end behavior under low grip needs to improve. The rider needs to feel more, trust more, commit more in the conditions that Brazil exposed. That is clear. That is undeniable at this point. But improving front-end confidence almost always comes at a cost to something else. Typically, the exit performance, the rear traction, the tire preservation characteristics that have been the foundation of Ducati's championship formula. They don't just need to tweak a setup, they need to improve front confidence without sacrificing rear advantage. Front loading versus rear loading, corner entry behavior versus corner exit behavior. Two fundamentally competing priorities in the same package. That is not an adjustment, that is a compromise. And compromise always costs something. The question Ducati's engineers are now facing is the most uncomfortable one in motorsport. What are we willing to lose in order to fix what is broken? Because Aprilia isn't standing still while they figure it out. Aprilia doesn't need to outdevelop Ducati in the laboratory. They just need the calendar to keep delivering imperfect conditions. And MotoGP's calendar always delivers imperfect conditions. Chapter 9. The illusion that Brazil destroyed. Ducati's most powerful weapon over the past 2 seasons was never raw speed alone. It was something more psychological, more pervasive, and ultimately more fragile. It was inevitability. They didn't just win races, they made outcomes feel predetermined. Rival riders and teams didn't just race against Ducati's performance, they raced against the expectation that Ducati would find a way to win regardless. That psychological weight is an enormous competitive advantage because it changes how rivals approach strategy, how aggressively they push, how much they believe a comeback is possible. Brazil broke that illusion completely. Every rider on the grid has now seen in 40-plus laps of undeniable evidence that there is a set of conditions under which Ducati can be beaten systematically, not just on one lap, not just at one corner, but across an entire race distance comprehensively by a rival who understood the conditions better and built a machine that thrives in them. The blueprint is out. The illusion is gone. And now every team, every rider, every strategist will spend the rest of the season looking for more Brazil-type conditions to exploit. Conclusion. Dominance conditional is dominance fragile. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody inside Ducati will say out loud. If they cannot give their riders a front tire they can trust when grip drops, then Aprilia does not have to chase this championship. They just have to wait for the conditions to deliver it. The standings show Bezzecchi leading with 56 points. That number is the surface. The real shift is underneath, invisible in the standings, invisible in the headlines, but completely visible to anyone who watched every lap of Brazil with the right analytical lens. Aprilia now dictates how races unfold. When conditions are clean and predictable, Ducati can fight. When conditions become unpredictable, when the track surface deteriorates, when temperatures push the tires to their limit, when grip disappears and riders are forced to rely on pure front-end trust, Aprilia takes over. That is not balance between two competitive packages. That is asymmetry. One side benefits from chaos, the other requires order. And MotoGP, with its changing weather, its varied surfaces, its calendar spanning continents and climates, delivers chaos far more often than it delivers order. Ducati's dominance is no longer universal, it is conditional. And conditional dominance, in a championship that runs 22 rounds across 12 months, is a different and far more fragile thing than what they have had. The fastest bike on the grid, if it needs perfect conditions to function at its peak, is not the best bike, it is the most fragile one. Brazil proved it. Aprilia understood it. And Ducati is now facing a question they haven't had to answer for 2 full seasons. Not whether they can win, they will win again. The real question is whether they can regain control, because without control, victories don't build championships. They just interrupt the ones being built by someone else.